Pleasure to be here in Abu Dhabi and here to speak to you this evening. And my thanks to the organisers of the workshop and the event for hosting it so well. It's been great. And this evening, I wasn't quite sure who the audience would be. I have a mixture of backgrounds and experience. So what I'm going to try and do is talk a bit about taste, matters of taste, a bit about the neuroscience, a bit about the psychology, and a bit about why I think people like myself need the help of philosophers in addressing this question. We'll see a few brain images, like the one we see here, of somebody doing something in a brain scanner. That's the image of neuroscience to many of us these days. You should be a little bit skeptical, though, because a few studies have come out in the last year saying that whenever you see a picture like this, a colourful brain image, you are much more likely to believe anything I say than without the picture. And the more colourful the picture, the more convincing I'll appear to you. So whenever I show one of these images, you might think twice about whether you should really believe what I'm saying. And my work is trained as a psychologist, but with an interest in neuroscience. And I'm interested in anything that involves more than one sense. I want to know about how what we see affects what we taste, what we smell affects what we feel. All the senses are of interest to me, and trying to understand how they interact. And I want to understand that both at a basic level, but also what motivates a lot of the research in my laboratory in Oxford is application. Once we know how the brain works, or a bit more about how the brain works and how the senses are connected, how can we use that insight in order to design anything from warning signals for cars to paint colours that go with fragrances, or, as tonight, the perception and the enjoyment and the design of new foods, new gustatory experiences, what you might call kind of neurogastronomy, designing foods around the brains of the consumer, the diner. And in that I've been very fortunate to work with this man, hopefully you can see up here, Heston Blumenthal, who's a chef at the Fat Duck restaurant, normally about number 2 or number 3 in the world rankings. And this is just half an hour from Oxford. Very unassuming restaurant, you can see here in the top left-hand corner. Just looks like any other kind of house in that part of the country. But he's a very innovative chef, I think, hence his ranking. And for me, it's a great kind of the most enjoyable collaboration I have. Because every 6 months or so, I get to go to the restaurant and eat dishes such as the ones you see here. We have triple cooked chips. We have parsnip breakfast cereals. Here, one of the very famous dishes, the snail porridge, which is a very strange combination of a breakfast cereal and snails and of a vivid, vivid green colour. Why would anybody make that? Why would anyone pay so much money to go and experience it? Well, all these dishes are very, very popular, and a number of them now embody insights that have come from neuroscience, from psychology, from understanding the senses and the brain of the diner. And if you were to go to his restaurant, you'll see this is very explicitly stated in the menu. You open it up, he will say to his diners that eating is the only thing that we do that involves all of the senses. I don't think we realise just how much influence the senses actually have on the way that we process the information from mouth to brain. So many things influence the way you perceive flavour, the acceptability, the basic tastes of sweet, sour, salt, bitter, and umami. Then astringency, metallic tastes, the smells, the colours, all the senses are involved. And he's very much interested and comes to Oxford and other places to try and get the latest insights about how we perceive taste and flavour, and then tries to design dishes around those insights. And we'll see a couple of examples of that this evening. Here, moving up the rankings to number 1 for Adria from Spain, El Bulli restaurant. He too was recently quoted that cooking is probably the most multisensual art. I try to stimulate all the senses when he cooks and prepares his dishes as well. So many of the world's best chefs are now getting more interested in the senses, how they interact, and how they can improve the taste and flavours of foods by understanding the brain. And if we were to summarise what the introduction to that menu of Heston's said, or what many people might think, which senses do contribute to the flavour of the foods we eat and the drinks we imbibe. Obviously, taste, what's going on in the tongue is important: salt, sour, bitter, sweet. Perhaps also smells very important in food perception. What we see, whether it's black or green or red, can influence flavour. Touch, oral somatosensation, the mouth feel, the texture, the temperature, the bitterness, the biting sting of a chili also is involved in this multisensory perception of flavour, as perhaps is also the sound of the crisp or the vegetable as you bite into that carrot and you hear the crack. So all the senses may be involved in contributing to our experience of flavour. And this is, as we've seen, of interest to the chefs. It's also of interest to the food producers. People like Unilever's and Procter & Gamble's, the world's biggest food companies, are now employing more psychologists and neuroscientists to understand taste and flavour as it's perceived up here. But I think it's also very important from a fundamental level as a basic scientist to study more how we perceive taste and flavour. This is captured by this kind of early quote from I.Z. Young, who notes that no animal can live without food. Let us then pursue the corollary of that, namely, food is about the most important influence in determining the organisation of the brain and the behaviour that the brain organisation dictates. So here, kind of suggesting we should spend much more time thinking about flavour rather than the other higher senses of hearing and vision. Because it's the most multisensory and perhaps one of the most important in determining brain development and function. So how can we do that? How can we understand the senses better? Well, people like myself will want to look inside the brain of people as they eat, as they drink, as they experience different flavours and sensations. And we want to try and understand the rules that govern whether, when I drink this water, say, is it what's going on in my tongue that's most important? Is it the colour of the drink? Is it the sound? Is it the smell, if it had one? Which sense will dominate my overall perception? And knowing that, those rules of integration, I can then design new foods that stimulate the most important sense most strongly. And we'll see a couple of the key rules that have come out of this basic research on flavour and how they're applied in restaurants. One rule that's very important, that we see in the perception of taste and flavour, is this idea of super additivity. And the notion is that our brains, if they perceive a very, very faint taste, something that's hardly perceptible, I'm not sure if there's something on my tongue or not, I won't really experience a flavour. If there's a very faint smell, say in a bottle, I won't experience a flavour or a smell either. But if I have a taste on my tongue and a very faint smell at the same time, I'll have a super additive response, a very strong flavour perception that's much greater than what I'd have predicted from taste alone, from smell alone, or just from adding those two very weak sensations. It's as if our brain amplifies those combinations of ingredients, smells, tastes, and colours that go together in food. And here we can see this for English or North American diners, consumers or participants, who are much more sensitive to the aroma, the fragrance of almond when they have a drop of sugar or saccharin on their tongue. They can perceive things they couldn't perceive before. By contrast, the very same individuals, if you put a drop of water on their tongue, that doesn't change their perception of smell. Even a drop of salt on their tongue will not change their perception of the almond odour. So it's a very specific combination of sweet taste on the tongue together with a very faint almond smell gives a very strong flavour percept. And this is of huge interest to the companies that make the flavours, the fragrances that goes into the foods we all eat every day, because here they can see how understanding the rules of integration in the brain can allow these companies to reduce the amount of almond fragrance in a food, in a sweet dessert, by just adding the right amount of sugar. And hence they can make their flavours more cheaply while giving you, the customer, exactly the same perceptual experience, but reducing the other less good for you ingredients. This is the UK and in North America, but in this study, there were 10 participants, 9 of them showed this pattern of results and 1 didn't. And that one person turned out to be from Japan. And normally in psychology experiments, you think 1 out of 10 is not a bad kind of failure rate, it's just noise. But Dalton and her colleagues were interested in following up to see if there really were differences between the way English and North Americans perceive flavour and people from Japan. And when they collected data from more Japanese participants, they found that was indeed the case. So here we can see that for the Europeans and North Americans, it's the same pattern of results again, that the faint almond odour with a drop of sugar on the tongue gave a big perceptual experience, but salt and almond did not. By contrast, for the Japanese participants, it was exactly reversed. These Japanese participants got a very strong flavour when salt was combined with an almond taste. So this kind of understanding the rules of sensory integration in the brain can sort of help to explain why something might taste wonderful to me, but not to the person sitting next to me, because each of our brains are integrating taste and smell differently, depending on the food with which we have been brought up, we have prior experience. So in the UK and in North America, the combination of sweet and almond is very popular in Bakewell tarts and in other sweet desserts. In Japan, that combination never occurs in their diet, but instead they're much more familiar with pickled condiments to go with their dishes that do contain salt and an almond smell. And their brains have learnt to integrate those cues from their own diet. And hence resulting in English, North Americans and Japanese living in quite different taste worlds and experiencing different kind of flavour percepts. And as a neuroscientist, we're not only interested in which rules govern sensory interaction, which sense dominates for which combination of ingredients. We also want to know whereabouts in your head do you experience sights, taste, the smell of food. And from many studies conducted to date, we know that when you're seeing me now, you'll be lots of activity in the back of your brain. The sound of my voice will be processed just over your ears, auditory cortex. The feel of your clothes, the chair you're sitting on, will be processed in a different part of the brain, and smell and taste. Each sense that's separate on the outside kind of has its own separate projection site in your brain. And so you might ask, or the chefs would ask, well, whereabouts do you experience flavour when you're eating one of my dishes in my restaurant? Is it somewhere up here at the top of the head or somewhere else? Again, this is a question of great interest at the moment, and the results of a number of brain imaging studies suggest that you experience kind of the pleasantness of food somewhere just behind the eyes here in the orbitofrontal cortex. And if you give people a food that tastes very good, that nice combination of almond and sugar, say, you'll get a superadditive perceptual experience, but you also see more blood flowing to this walnut-sized bit of your brain. So that now, companies or researchers can decide how much you like a particular food, a dish, without having to ask you about it. They'll just measure your brain's response, and the more blood we see flowing there, and the particular activation of blood flow in the orbitofrontal cortex will give a very good indicator whether you like it, and if so, how much. And hence more and more chefs are thinking about how can they get more blood flowing to this part of your brain by giving you a particular dish. So I explained why maybe the chefs and the food companies are interested in taste and flavour, but we're here in amongst philosophers, and why might philosophy play a role in what seems just like an empirical question? Well, there are a number of books out there now on food, taste and philosophy, one on food and philosophy, food and beer, and here one from Barry Smith, our esteemed next speaker, on questions of taste. So there are kind of a growing number of philosophers interested in taste and in flavour. And for me, I think there are three questions that are or three controversies in the literature about flavour and taste, where the psychologists and the neuroscientists and the chefs can't really come to any resolution or answer, but where maybe a clear philosophical mind might help. The first is this confusion between taste and flavour. And very often when we talk about this dish tastes nice, do we literally mean this taste, what's going on in my tongue, or do we mean the flavour of the dish, including the smell and all the other sensory cues? A second question that's perplexing a lot of us at the minute is which senses exactly contribute to flavour perception? We know maybe taste and perhaps smell, but does touch, does vision, does hearing, and in which way do the senses contribute? And thirdly, if I were to ask you to list how many senses do you have, people would start, maybe I can see, I can hear, I can smell, I can taste, I can touch. Maybe there's a sense of balance, sense of gravity. The numbers vary, but should you also say we have a sense of flavour in addition to the sense of taste and smell? And if so, what does that mean and how could we justify the claim? If we start with the first problem about this taste-flavour confusion, it pervades the literature, and we'll see an example of that at the minute, that when people are talking about tasting foods, I think very often they mean the flavour of foods. And we'll see why it might be that we confuse those two terms so often in our daily language. The debate here is, of course, clouded by the fact that taste and flavour, those terms sometimes are not separated in different languages. Sometimes there's just one word for all of those kind of experiences in the mouth. But in English, at least, we have taste and flavour. And if you think, why do we sometimes experience or talk about flavours, the smell of food, as if it's a taste? Perhaps that's because we mislocalise our experiences into our mouth. So when I'm eating and drinking, there will be smells going in and going out of my nose, but I don't localise the taste of the food in my nose. Instead, it's localised in my mouth, on my tongue. And that might be because of all the tactile cues, all the touch, the texture, the movement of my lips and mouth is leading to the almost ventriloquism, moving the smells from my nose into my oral cavity, and hence I experience anything that goes on in here as a taste and want to call hence smells and other things as tastes because they all occur in this location. And maybe that's not a problem to confuse our terms, to talk about flavour when we mean taste or taste when we mean flavour. I've just taken one recent edited volume on taste, gustatory taste, the taste culture reader from Korsmeyer. In this edited volume, we see her setting up. She's going to talk about tastes, flavours, smells, colour of food, neurogastronomy, all these topics. And she starts out, except where otherwise specified, the word taste in this book will serve as a shorthand for the experience of flavour in all its dimensions, including those supplied by the other senses, by smell, by the eyes, I guess, and so on. But we can see very quickly that this leads into kind of problems and conflicts when we just turn over 2 pages and we see her continuing that not all flavours can be classified according to the 4 basic types. And some of the most sought after tastes are actually spices. And here there seems to be a sort of utter confusion. What are these 4 basic flavours? I think what she means are the 4 basic tastes on your tongue, coded only by your tongue: salt, sour, bitter, and sweet. And when she's talking about here that some of the most sought after tastes are spices, what she really means is that most of the sought after flavours are spices, because most spices contain both something going on your tongue, a burning sensation of a chili pepper, say, or a particular astringency, but they also have a big odour component, the smell of the spice, either before or during eating. So here I think this failure to discriminate between taste and flavour is leading to a confusion about what one means. And for myself, I work both with the chefs, but also try to publish basic research papers. And this confusion between taste and flavour is one that can irritate no end the people who review my work. And and you have to avoid that as much as possible. So here we have one reviewer from just before Christmas, where once in my article I said flavour when I meant taste, or the other way around. And there are pages and pages of this reply. This person's very upset that I confused my terms. The authors are confused about the meaning of flavour. Flavour is a combination of tastes and of smells, and it's not the same thing as taste. Taste refers only to the qualities detected by the taste receptors, the sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, protein taste on the tongue. Flavours, by contrast, includes taste, but also includes the olfactory components of the food experience. So, for example, the flavour of orange juice includes not only the sweetness I get on my tongue, but also the olfactory component detected by the receptors in the nose, which can be best described as oranginess, orange or fruit flavour. So I think here we should keep our terms clear, and I'll try to do so from now on, and only talk about flavour when I mean the combination of taste and this other stuff, and taste when I mean just salt, sour, bitter, and sweet. If we move to the second question about, well, which senses actually contribute to this perception of flavour? If you ask anybody in the street, they would say, well, it's all about what's going on in your tongue. That's kind of the folk wisdom, that flavour is primarily about what's happening in here. As we've seen, there's some evidence that smells also play a role. Smell does play a big role. And until recently, these were the two senses that researchers thought gave rise to our perception of flavour. More recently, it's been expanded to also include the touch, the mouthfeel, the temperature, the texture, the astringency in your mouth. And the big boys have waded into the debate. So the International Standards Organization have come out with their declaration of 1992. This is what flavour is. Reiterated in 2008. According to them, flavour is a complex combination of the olfactory, the gustatory, and the trigeminal sensations perceived during tasting. The flavour may be influenced by tactile, thermal, painful, or other kinesthetic effects. So they say flavour is all about just these three senses and no more. They never mention the sound of food or the sound of us eating, and they make no mention of the sight or the colour of food. And I've been struggling, my colleagues have been struggling for the last few years thinking about whether this is the appropriate definition, that flavour should only be used to describe these three senses and not hearing and not vision. And if not, why not? Are there principled reasons behind that? And if we're trying to kind of picture the international standards definition, we can say we sometimes have smell experiences, olfactory experiences. We sometimes have taste experiences, and we sometimes have textural, touch, temperature experiences in our mouth. And an experience of flavour only occurs when we have all three of these senses stimulated at the same time. So flavour exists there in the intersection when all three of these individual senses are stimulated. But what about hearing? Firstly, you might say, does what we hear influence our perception of taste and flavour? And if so, how does it do so? Because maybe the International Standards Organization are okay if we can show that hearing doesn't influence taste at all. And this is work that we did a couple of years ago for Unilever, a very serious science project. And in fact, all my money comes from industry, from food companies and car companies. But for some reason, the popular press thought this is a bizarre and ridiculous experiment to do. So we were ignominiously awarded the Ig Nobel Prize for Nutrition just over a year ago for this bizarre experiment that anybody could do, I guess, that requires just a packet of Pringles potato chips that are ideal for our purposes, because as a psychologist, we like to give people lots and lots of trials and see how the perception changes from one trial to the next in one condition versus the other. And Pringles are perfect because they're all exactly the same size, exactly the same shape. And we can give people, as we did in our experiment, 180 Pringles to bite into and evaluate for their freshness, for their taste, for how salty they were. And what we did is just manipulate the sound that people heard. So they're biting into a crisp, and we have a microphone by their mouth that's picking up the sounds as they bite and they eat, and those sounds are taken away to a computer, made louder or quieter. We make the sounds more high-pitched or more low-pitched, and then we feed them back over headphones to our participants, who are busily munching away, having to rate each Pringle in terms of its crispness, its freshness, and its saltiness. And what we find is that people cannot ignore what they hear when they're trying to judge the taste of that potato chip. That as we make the sound of the food louder when they eat it, or when we boost the high frequency sounds, either of those manipulations will make the crisp taste crisper and fresher. Making the sound quieter or boosting the low frequency sounds will make the crisp seem older and softer and not as nice. And this holds true that sound influences our texture and taste perception, both for potato chips, but for any other food that might make a noise, be it a crisp carrot or your breakfast cereals in the morning. And now many food companies are using this technique in order to try and design new foods that are better tasting because they're better sounding. And you might think, is that an illusion? Do I want to be tricked in this way? Well, in some cases it might be good for us, in that if I'm evaluating the perception of carbonation, how fizzy this drink of water is, then I use, again, not only my taste buds and my tongue, my touch, but also the sound of the popping and the sizzling in the glass to arrive at a decision about how fizzy the drink is. So companies are now trying to reduce the amount of acid that rots your teeth, that gives rise to the fizzy sensation we like in a drink, by changing the sound the drink makes, and hence keeping your perception the same, but making healthier foods. The other place in which you might see this research popping up is in places like the Fat Duck, where now, depending on the time of year, if you go for the tasting menu, you might have 20, 25 different courses of food. You'll have your knives, your forks, your spoons, and some of the dishes. You'll have no cutlery, and the waiter will come up to you and say, open wide, and will insert the food in your mouth to take you back to your childhood experiences of eating. It's the same food, but the experience is completely different when somebody else is serving you. And here in about course number 18 or 19, what you have instead is a pair of headphones as your cutlery, if you will, and people are given a noisy food together with some dipping sauce so they can try for themselves to experience how important sound is to food. You also see this in hospital settings, where as the population ages, there are things we can do for the loss of sight. We have glasses, hearing aids for loss of hearing, but as yet there's nothing we can do for the loss of taste and smell that affects us all as we get older, and that starts to affect us very adversely when we get to 60 or 70 years of age. And so many companies are again thinking about, can we make food for the older, for the greying population, taste better by playing with their residual senses like hearing, vision and touch, given that we can't bring back the taste buds once they have declined. So the results like this, I think, are important, both on an applied level, but also sort of when thinking about flavour, I'd want to take that International Standards Organisation definition and expand it a bit and say that we really have to make room for the sound of food in our definitions of flavour. It seems to play much the same role, as far as I can see, as taste, as smell, and as touch in the mouth. Which leaves us then just with vision, the eyes, the colour of food. And here we think, well, maybe vision will play the same role. When I change the colour of a food, will it actually change the flavour of the dish? And I'll tell you just about two examples of this. One of my favourite kind of apocryphal experiments, until you find the original reference and somebody really did do this, Not a psychologist, because we wouldn't be allowed to do such things, but a marketing executive interested in the colour of foods and packaging, who brought some friends and colleagues home for dinner. The lighting was dim, dark. They were sitting around the table. It was the 1970s, so in England you got steak, chips and peas. That's kind of the dish of the day. Everything looks fine. You start eating the dish. And then at some point halfway through the meal, the room lights are brought back up to normal. And what you see is, in fact, that this piece of meat is a vile bluish-purple colour. The chips are really green, and the peas on the plate are bright red. And it's really this blue steak that causes you problems, and that caused his dinner guest problems, many of whom were immediately ran off to the bathroom to be sick. So showing a very powerful effect of colour on our sort of appetitive or our responses to food. You might say, well, it shows that colour has some influence in how we respond to foods, but this example doesn't show that changing the colour of a food actually changes the taste or the flavour that you identify. But there are many other studies that do that job for us. Here, one classic old study from Dubose and colleagues, who gave people a variety of fruit-flavoured drinks. And these fruit-flavoured drinks could arrive in a whole host of different colours from one cup to the next. And your task was to try to identify the flavour of that drink. Does it taste of cherry flavour to you, of orange or of lime? And what Dubose and colleagues found was that people's judgments of the identity of the flavour, say of a cherry-flavoured drink, if the drink was served colourless, just like this, then about 40% of people could say yes, correctly detect and identify the cherry flavour. You could improve the cherry flavour, if you will, by colouring the drink red, and now 70%, the majority of people, are getting a nice, clear cherry flavour. Try colouring the drink an inappropriate colour like orange, and suddenly, for the first time, a fifth of people are saying that tastes of orange juice to me, and colour the drink green instead, and now a quarter of the audience, the participants, are detecting a lime flavour instead. So here it seems changing the colours of foods do play a very important role in changing our perception of the identity of flavours, be it of fruit drinks, be it of any other product that you might buy in the supermarket. People think very carefully about exactly which colour that dish should be to evoke the right expectation. I should say there is a bit of debate here. We know that colour changes your perception of the identity of the flavour. What we're not quite so sure about is how much colour, if I make the colour a bit darker red, will it taste a little bit more intensely of cherry or of strawberry or raspberry? That is still a question, empirical question for the psychologists. So at this point, you might say, okay, we've shown, just like hearing, that what we see changes our flavour of food. How are we to explain that effect, this visual dominance over flavour, taste and smell perception? Well, maybe I can just refer back to the psychology literature and to one of the most famous examples of how the senses interact. This illusion discovered by accident by Harry McGurk and MacDonald in 1976. And here I show you the video taken from a presentation at the National Portrait Gallery in London from Vicky Bruce and colleagues. So what I'd like you to do is to look at the face on the left of the screen and to think about which sound do you hear the person saying. You should hear something like bar, bar, bar. Now look at the face on the right and think about what you hear going into your ears. And you should hear something like dar, bar instead. And of course it could be a trick. I could have changed the sound or something between telling you to open your eyes. But if now you look back and forth, Whenever you look to the left, you'll hear bar. Whenever you look to the right, you'll hear da or va. So you know you're being fooled somehow. The sound is always the same. If you close your eyes, you can hear that the real thing going in your ears is a bar sound. So now open your eyes again and look to the right. And you should find it impossible not to hear da or tha. So what that shows is that our perception of what we think we're hearing when somebody's talking is, in this case, being dominated, changed by what we see. And the difference between those two faces was just the nature of the lip movements that the person was uttering. But if I understand the rules about how hearing and vision combine, I can fool you, I can give you illusions, I can change the sound of the person by changing what their lips look like they are doing. Again, an example of vision dominating over hearing. We might think this is very similar to vision dominating over flavour. In both cases, knowing the rules of interaction or integration allow us to use one sense to change our experience in another sense, or I'll change our flavour perception. And if that were true, that would be great, because there are maybe 30, 40 years now of research on this particular illusion in the laboratory. And we know everything about it, exactly how much vision dominates hearing, and under exactly which conditions, and in exactly which countries of the world it doesn't work so well, like Holland and Japan. And we could take all those insights from the psychology of hearing and vision and apply them to the world of taste and flavour, and we've saved ourselves a whole lot of experimental work and got a whole lot of the sort of theoretical questions out of the way. But I think maybe that's not the right way to think about colour's effect on the flavours of the foods we eat and the drinks that we consume. Primarily because in illusions like this, they only work when I synchronise the sound and the voice. If you saw the lips before you heard the sound, there would be no illusion. If you saw somebody's lips over there, but heard their voice over here, there would be no illusion. By contrast, in the case of coloured foods, I can see a food and its colour, that it's red or orange or green, and some seconds later, some time later, take a drink, and that earlier colour experience will change my flavour perception. So unlike speech and the taste and smell example I started with, the almond and the sugar, those are very sensitive to having all the senses coming at the same time. But the colour of food influences us when we see the food, and in fact we never see the food that's in our mouths, so visual flavour occurs before and in a different position from what's going on in our mouths. So that might lead one to think that yes, I'm not denying that colour can change your perception of the identities of flavours of foods in the laboratory, in the supermarket, or in the restaurant, but that the mechanism here might be very different from the one I mentioned so far. That maybe when you see a food, that just sets up an expectation, a belief about what you are about to consume, and it's that expectation that drives the cherry flavour in DeBose's experiment. So here's kind of a cognitive expectancy, a cognitive belief that is based, again, on your prior experience. Because if I showed you an orange drink, if you come from England, you'll think orange juice. It's going to have an orange flavour, and that expectation will then drive what flavour you actually experience in a drink that is that colour. If I give the same orange coloured drink to people in Taiwan, they don't drink orange juice, they have lots of mango. And for them, that orange colour leads to an expectation that they're going to have a mango flavoured drink. It's very popular. And hence, if I give them actually an orange, they'll really taste mango. So here again, the part of the world in which we grow up determines what expectations we have or associate with particular colours. And hence, I can change your perception of taste and flavour either by changing the colour of the food, or just as in this case, by changing the colour of the packaging, or by writing something, a label, a brand, a name on the front of that piece of packaging will change our flavour experience. So here, the colour of the food is acting like some sort of label and needn't actually be in the food itself to influence us. And here again, we can use this sort of insight in the fat duck experience, where in one of the early courses on the menu, the waiter will come up very seriously and present this dish to you and say, this is a beetroot and orange jelly, and we recommend that you start with a beetroot. So what will people do? They'll be driven by their eyes, and beetroots are kind of this purple colour, so they'll start tasting that, happily carry on, not be aware that there's anything wrong, because the expectation of beetroot from purple is so strong in the UK. And then the waiter might come along and say, well, maybe you should try closing your eyes, or are you really sure about the flavour? And what it turns out is that when you cook a beetroot, it loses its vivid purple colour and becomes orange. But if you take a blood red orange, that's naturally this very vivid purple colour. And so you can play with people's expectations again, get their eyes to trick them, and then show them how by closing their eyes or perhaps opening their eyes, they might be able to change the flavour that they get in their mouth. So then we think flavours, the four senses, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. The smell when we're eating. Those are all combined with these rules of integration and sensory dominance, whereas vision plays a slightly different role mechanistically in terms of driving our flavour perception. And hence, we might think, well, we can change the colour of the packaging, the colour of the food, the label. And this is part of the reason why, at least in the UK, we've seen a shift towards more and more descriptive food labels, because people are realising just how important calling your fruit, mixed fruit drink a smoothie, calling it sort of mango. If they didn't call it mango, you wouldn't know what was going on. So labelling is very important. And the more detailed labelling you provide about the foods and flavours in the supermarket or in the restaurant, the more pleasurable the experience will be, and the more you will pay for the dish. And there's research suggesting the more intense the flavours will be as well. And if vision plays a slightly different role, it sets up an expectation, a context, if you like, even an atmosphere. We thought maybe we could do the same thing with hearing. And this is something that Barry has worked on and talked about previously. I'm not quite sure what the analogy is for here. The experience of many people in the UK, it's cold and wet, and the last month has been deep under snow. So we very much cherish our chance to go to the Mediterranean for a holiday in the sun. And there, things seem to taste better. I mean, they have a better flavour in the Mediterranean than back home. And very often we'll buy particular foods, wines, sausages, other delicious things that we've eaten on the beach in the sunshine in the Mediterranean, bring them home, and then open them one cold winter night, and the experience isn't the same. It's the same bottle, and as Barry notes, the transport conditions shouldn't have changed the flavour, and yet the flavour does change. It's just not the same thing, drinking it under the sun as it is back at home. So that suggests that not only the colour or the product, the food itself, not only the packaging in which it's presented, but also the atmosphere or the environment in which you eat and drink are integrated or make predictions, set up a context that influences the food in the bottle, on the dish, and so on. And so for the fat duck, which isn't situated in the Mediterranean, but in kind of the outskirts of Slough, a grim industrial town on the outskirts of London, maybe we could make foods taste better by trying to recapture the atmosphere of the Mediterranean. We could play with, I guess, the temperature in the restaurant. We haven't done that yet, but I know a number of stores that already do that. We've seen how we play with the colour of the food. There are some restaurants now playing with the colour of the walls. Our approach was to play with the sound that you hear. We've shown how the sound of chips and carrots could be changed. We thought if we give people a seafood dish like this, that looks a bit like the seaside, it's got seaweed and foam, a bit like the waves breaking on the beach, something that looks like sand, would that dish have a better flavour if we recreated the sounds of the sea. So when this dish comes to the diners in the restaurant, in the fat duck, we recapture the sounds of the English seaside, at least. We have the seagulls, and this will come in an iPod inside a seashell. Again, the waiter will bring this to the table before the plate appears, recommend that you put the headphones in, and then serve the dish. And that shouldn't affect the flavour. It really shouldn't. It's up there, and yet it does. It changes people's perception. We've done experiments with oysters, with ice creams, where by changing the environmental sound, we can change the identity of the flavour that you ascribe to an ice cream. And we can also change the pleasantness you get out of eating an oyster, or in this case, a dish on the menu. So again, we think this is working in the same way that the sound of the environment, perhaps even the smells of the environment, are all acting to set up a context in which is influencing, by expectancy, your multisensory perception. And we can use these insights then to design the new dishes, the new cutlery, the new atmosphere for the restaurant that makes the dining experience better. And I'll finish just coming back to the starting point, thinking about why do we often say taste when we mean flavour? Why do we, is it just something that what we call taste is anything that we experience in the mouth? And if we ventriloquize the smells from our nose into our mouth, the sounds from our ears into the Pringle in your mouth, then maybe that's why we confuse these two terms. So that might lead to the prediction you could only ever experience flavours in here. There's no other way, because that's part of the definition of flavour. It's something that happens in here. So we've been very interested to think, could you take flavour perception out of the mouth somehow? And we have some bizarre techniques we're trying in the laboratory, none of which have worked yet, involving rubber arms and rubber tongues in order to try and move sensations out of the mouth. But there is one naturally occurring example, which comes from the world of synesthesia, from the world, these small proportion of the population who get confused. They when they think about numbers or see letters or days of the week, they hear sounds at the same time, sounds that no one else will hear, but the same sound always associated with Monday, the same colour, that Tuesday is always green, Monday is always blue. And there is one case at least of a synesthete, somebody who confuses their senses, who actually reports, it's a man, not as the artist has drawn it, who, when they reports experiencing flavours kind of in their hand, as shapes in their hand. So we've got one case at least of maybe a pathological case of a synesthete who reports experiencing flavours out of the mouth, suggesting that isn't critical to our definition. And I'll leave you with what we're trying to do at the minute that follows on from this idea about synesthesia and taste. And I think there are lots of questions to ask there about is this taste-smell confusion that we all experience when our nose is blocked and we think we lost our sense of taste? Are we all synesthetes in a sense for flavour or not? But in a practical sense, what we're trying to do is now for the menus of dishes at the Fat Duck and elsewhere, is play on these synesthetic links that we all have between particular shapes and sounds, between particular sounds and feels, and in this case between particular sounds and tastes or flavours. And what we do now is give people a whole range of different foods to eat, including chocolate and crisps, cheese and acidic, slightly tart cranberries, and ask them to decide for each of these foods, is it a boo-boo or a kiki? another sort of bizarre thing to do. Why should people agree on that? And yet in our laboratory tests and on the online experiments that you can do on the Fat Duck website now, the majority of people will describe cranberries, they're kiki. A brie cheese is the most boo-boo kind of food we've come across. And so here we're starting to play with the idea that maybe the names, the sounds, not only just the meaning of the names of dishes, but the sounds. Cranberry's got a hard sound, that maybe food names that we describe using hard sounds, that sets up an expectation about taste. And that what we can even do now is we create a new ice cream for the menu, and we want to know what to call it. And we want to give them a creamy experience. We know that we should call it frosh ice cream rather than frish ice cream. Because again, that frosh, the kind of O sound, people have done experiments to show that's associated with a creamier kind of taste. And so if you get the chance to go to the Fat Duck soon, you may find dishes that initially have no label. You have 2 plates of food, where Heston's tried to capture the most kiki kind of food, the most sharpest, and the most boo-boo, rounded, soft and creamy kind of dish. You'll eat the 2 plates, and then by turning over the plates, we'll be able to predict which food name you would have associated there. Again, showing the link between the sound of names and their taste. And I think, too, you may see that appearing in sort of supermarkets more and more, that they start not only changing the colour, the smells, the taste of the dishes, but also the labels to set up certain sorts of expectations about what you're going to do. So I shall leave it there, but hope that you can see why I think flavours so interesting. Because I think it's really, it's been underplayed in the psychology and the neuroscience literature for so long. It's kind of hard thing to work with. Smells and tastes are messy. People adapt if you give them too much of the same stuff. These are lower senses, and serious scientists should be thinking about the eyes and hearing, the highest, more kind of senses. But I think there are good reasons to start spending more time on flavour, both because it seems to be kind of one of the most multisensory of our experiences, and also because it's something that we do every day. And so the insights we get from the laboratory, I think, can be applied both in the top-end restaurant, but also to improve anybody's flavour experiences. And it's really an area that I work in where I see the most confusion about the terms that the psychologists, the neuroscientists, even the chefs use, and where the philosophical approach can hopefully shed some light and say this is what terms you should be using, this is why, and don't get confused. So, thank you very much.
The local organisers for such spectacular organisation and hospitality. It's been a great pleasure. It's also a great pleasure of mine to be able to now work with Charles and to pursue some of the philosophical interests I had in taste. Until I came across him, I was pretty much restricted to talking to psychologists and neuroscience in France, especially at the universities of Bordeaux and Dijon. And because of the French culture and its concern with cheese and with wine, most of the taste experience is often focused on these products. But now I'm introduced to kiki, boo-boo, frosh, frish flavors with Charles, and a whole new range of experiences open up. So Charles is right that we need to, as philosophers and psychologists, get together and try to rethink the way we understand the senses. We have been far too preoccupied in philosophy and in psychology with looking at vision. And what we now know, especially, is that vision may be the odd one out. It might actually be the most exceptional of the senses, the one which, as Charles points out, has quite a dominant effect on all of the others, and may function and work in ways that don't give us clues and insights into everything else. So the idea of studying vision and hoping to move to the other sounds like hearing and touch, certainly taste and smell, will not work. And that's why I think taste is particularly important, because we start by thinking taste is this single experience that we always have by putting something in our mouths, and then we come to realize, as Charles says, that we're always having an experience which we call taste by exercising taste, touch and smell. Now, unlike Charles, I want to stop there. I want to say there are influences that other sensory modalities can have, but they are clues and they are guides to what to expect. But I think it's taste, touch, and smell in collaboration which are going to make up flavor as I would define it. But I also want to introduce another distinction, and it's a distinction which leads to my first question, which is, if Charles is right and this experimental work is impressive, it's staggering, should we just think that what we call flavor is a psychological construct? Is it some sort of compote that is made internally by the workings of the internal sensory systems, and that flavor is something that doesn't correspond actually to anything out there in the external world? We would disappoint the French enormously by saying that their cheeses and their wines and many of their other products have no flavor, but that we can concoct that. But of course it was actually an old French view. Brillat-Savarin said that perhaps you should see taste as a factory that's in the mouth, and the chimney is the nose, and they are one system that collaborate to produce these experiences. But then, should we settle for this view that flavor is just something psychologically constructed? So I want to ask, do the foods and liquids we eat and drink really have flavors, or are they just in the mind of the perceiver? Well, here's another distinction that Charles didn't make, and psychologists often don't make, and philosophers are going to be very hot on. They're going to try to distinguish between flavors and flavor perception, just as we might distinguish between colors and the perception of color, sounds and the perception of sound. Now, certainly there's an intense and intricate relation, intimate relation between these things, but we might wonder whether we nevertheless have room for a distinction. And we might wonder whether what Charles is talking about and revealing to us is a number of ways in which our perceptions can be affected, altered, perhaps distorted, perhaps we have illusory experiences, and still leave room for flavor perception which does get at something which is really objectively there, something like the flavors that we think foods and drinks actually have. And I'm tempted to try to defend a view of flavors as being objective and as being something which really isn't just in me, but is probably in the food and the liquid that I consume. However, Charles's scientific views about flavor perception, very scientific, very rigorous, very tested, curiously enough, have a kind of alliance with an ordinary folk psychological view, a view that you hear regularly announced and very commonly expressed, and that's the idea that taste is subjective. Isn't taste just an individual pleasure? Isn't it just something for you, as it were? It's definitely something that happens inside you, it's in the mouth, it's very close, it's very intimate to you, can't be experienced surely by someone else because they are just not having the same equipment put to work. Now, this view of taste as subjective would seem to get a kind of scientific confirmation if Charles is right, and for a philosopher who thinks, no, I want to see a distinction between our perception of the world and how the world really is, and I want to locate some of the properties that I think I perceive out there, or perhaps the sort of properties which selectively human beings with our particular receptors and our sensitivities are attuned to. I want to see whether we can still have room for that. So let's see, why do people say that taste is subjective? Or why do they think that taste, or as we mean by that, flavor in Charles's sense, why do we think that flavor is wholly subjective, or taste in the ordinary way of talking is wholly subjective? Well, because it's an immediate and intimate personal experience, it's transitory, it's ephemeral, and it seems non-contestable. Somebody can't tell you, no, it just doesn't taste like that. You would simply say, well, that's how it tastes to me. And perhaps you would insist that there's no getting away from the fact that how things appear to you when you're chewing them or swallowing them is how they are at the taste level. Now, can I cancel that? I noticed you had to do this 1 or 2 times. Okay, good. Now, why do we say that? Well, we think that's what taste is, but there's also this fact that there's a great variation in taste judgments. You and I may enjoy eating and drinking many of the same things, but there will always come a moment, even with those of you who happily go along the same route, where you'll say, that's very good, or that's very salty, or that's delicious, or that is tastes of lime, and I'll say not at all. Now, the variation that you see is what immediately lets people think, taste isn't actually answerable to something in there, it's just answerable to the sensations that individuals are having. And these disagreements can lead to irresolvable differences. But I want the irresolvable differences not to come to an end, as it were. I don't want people to say, well, that's how you taste it, this is how I taste it. I mean, it's true that when you're disputing what something tastes like, what qualities it has, perhaps even how good it is, you will come to a point where you really can't resolve your disagreements. But I think even if you say, well, we must agree to differ, each of you goes away feeling quite contented that you've got it right and the other's got it wrong. You may not say that, politeness may restrict us, but that's what you actually think. And I want to honor that way of thinking about taste. Now, I think there are puzzling responses, and this is what got me interested in taste and people's reactions to it. There's a puzzling response because sometimes people will say, well, taste is just a personal matter, isn't it? It's just a matter of how it is for me or what I like. And those very same people will sometimes say, when you bring out your very best dishes or your most exquisite coffee or your most refined flavours, they'll say, no point in giving me this very fancy stuff. Even if there are many factors in influencing flavour perception, what would we think about flavours or tastes themselves? Well, I mean, the flavour percept, as Charles said, is enormously complicated. He had the ISO's rather authoritarian flavour definition, but I mean, even if you just start to think what's going on in a perception of flavour, you've got the idea that when you're tasting a liquid, you've got this multisensory integration of olfactory, tactile, taste impressions. It's modulated by the timing. You will taste things differently at different parts of the mouth. You will have different experiences as a food or liquid appears in the mouth to begin with, when you've masticated and chewed it, when you're swallowing it, many things will change. There's a dynamic time course to flavour perception. It's actually very, very different at different times as things glide through your mouth. Some liquids, some smoothies and fruit juices, they're called smoothies because they have a certain mouthfeel, they have a certain feel as they travel across the palate, as they flow from the entry into the mouth, across the tongue, and to your swallowing. So how can we reconcile these delicately changing experiences in which competing flavours may be reconciled in some sort of harmonious way with the idea that the flavours belong to the liquids or the particular foods that you've eaten, that they're characteristics, they're real features of those things that you're imbibing? How could we have that? Well, you might resort to a very, very impoverished view of the objectivity of taste. You might say, well, look, Charles is right. Once we get up to the level of kind of rich flavour experiences, there's no grounding this out in terms of direct response to things in the environment. But we could always backtrack and look at a kind of objectivity that should be easier to establish when we just restrict ourselves to taste, gustation, that which is about receptors firing on the tongue. And you might say, as Dana Small says, primary function of gustatory taste is not to identify foods, but rather to identify the substances in food and drink that may promote or disrupt homeostasis. So it's very important in the body to keep the salt-water balance right. If you're not getting enough salt, you really have to be able to detect it. You crave it and you'll try things, and if they're salty, that's good. You will take those in. Toxicity will be given to you by bitterness. If you're tasting foods that are bitter, that's going to be a good guide that you don't want anymore, that this herb may not be good for you. The quality of acids in your body and the acids that you might sometimes be more or less sensitive to can tell you things about the internal health and constitution of the body. So again, it's not obviously a bad thing that you're really quite sensitive to and can detect acidity levels. And of course, sugars are going to give you energy. You're going to want to have enough sugar. So maybe we say only these basic tastes. Maybe only these basic tastes are objective. Maybe everything else is going to be far too messy, far too subjective. And maybe the basic tastes, if they can be tracked to things outside us, like salt, like toxic products, like acids and sugars, we will get a way of relating that to the underlying chemistry, to the analytic chemistry or the molecular chemistry of the compounds that we're looking at. But even here, it's not so simple. It's not so simple because the way those chemicals affect us is to do with perceptual faculties. Here's a lovely, interesting thing, which if it comes off, will make a difference to all of our health. It turns out that what matters to tasting salt isn't the sheer volume of salt compound that you're having, it's how many receptors are touched by NaCl, by salt products. So people are trying to design in chemistry now salt molecules which spread further across the tongue so it touches more receptors. So the food will be perceived as saltier, but you will in fact be ingesting less of the chemical, which is good for health reasons. So tasters can't quite be eliminated from our description of something as salty, as having a salty flavor. It's going to be dependent on the chemistry, but it's not going to be exactly reducible to the chemistry. But there's also a problem with this idea too, and the idea is that if it's only basic tastes and it's combinations of them that we're able to detect, then we really would be limited to picking out those objective flavors of things which were just amalgams of salt, sweet, sour, bitter, metallic perhaps. That's just not the case. It's also not the case that what we're calling basic tastes are really perhaps so basic. When you talk about sourness, sourness is not a single taste experience. You can think of the sourness of vinegar and the sourness of lemon, and that's rather different. You can think of different kinds of sweet product. But look, here are some things which we're easily able to recognize and about which there's a lot of agreement. There's an enormous amount of commonality. Here's a quote from Frank Sibley, a esthetician, who says, "Consider the taste of some of the following: ripe mangoes, fresh figs, lemon, cantaloupe, raspberries, coconut, green olives, ripe persimmon, onion, caraway, parsnip, peppermint, aniseed, cinnamon, fresh salmon, pepper, mint. And for smells, burning leaves, mold, lavender, heated vinegar, etc." Now, are these mixtures of separate tastes? Do we want to say that we can recognize those, and we do think they correlate very well with the products that produce them? We can go and find and track these things down, we can identify them, we can have expectations about what experiences we have, and we're largely right, and with a lot of commonality between us. Are they just mixtures of separate tastes? Not obviously so. Sibley has a nice distinction between simple tastes, single tastes, which raspberries, mint, and so on have, onion, and simple tastes. They're not simple. Presumably, there's a lot of complexity in the flavor of an onion or the flavor of a raspberry or peach or mango, but they're single in that we treat them as single flavors. We don't see them as made up of different parts. And in fact, we're hopeless if we try to say which components go in to making this flavor. I mean, he has this nice thing: to make the flavor of onion, pepper, or raspberries or olives, add the following flavors in the following proportions. You can't do it. You can't think what other constituents would go in there to make an onion. For you, it's a single, simple thing. And we're by and large very reliably able to lock onto those. So they're easily identifiable, recognizable. Variation isn't found here, which may suggest that one reason for variation is when we come to complex flavors. When we start combining flavors, people are not so good, and agreement tends to go down. We start to see a lot of disagreement once we look at complex and compound flavors. Why? Because they're not so often experienced. They're not so easily recognizable. They're deliberately put together to give us new experiences, to delight us. We don't want to just have the same experiences again and again. As children, we probably want more and more of the same, the things we like, but as adults, we We want richer experiences. We want variety. We want divergence. But we're going to be at the mercy of having complex experiences, not all of which we're going to be able to clearly recognize, identify, and re-experience the same way each time or as the same way between one another. But another reason might not just be complexity. Another element might be this affective or hedonic response. When you put something in your mouth, you pretty much decide really rather fast whether you like it or not. Am I going to swallow this? Am I going to not? No more for me, thanks. I'm good. I couldn't eat another spoonful. But if you're taking something in and making this quick decision, it seems as though the hedonic value of the food or the liquid is something that's very closely tied to that experience. And that makes matters of taste depend on subjects as well as depending on the objects that they're imbibing, and where there's room for individual subjective variation, where there's a variety of subjectivities in us and in our likings, that might give rise to what we think of as this variety or variation in tastes. But are they variations in the tastes or flavors, or just in our perception or responses to them? Okay, subjectivity and objectivity. So there's how things taste, and then there's their being to our taste. We might be able to identify things and know what they're like and not find them agreeable, or find them very agreeable. And it may be that it's the very same things that we're tasting. We're having the same sensory awareness or perception of the food, which is a good guide to some of its properties, and after that comes the liking or the disliking. That model suggests that there's a division between the affective or evaluative part of taste experience and the primitive or sensory part of perceiving a taste. And a lot of people have held this view, and Voltaire expresses it nicely where he says, taste invites reflection. So the idea is you first have the taste, I'm experiencing something's taste, and then as a response, a reflection upon that, I like, I don't like. They would come one after another. So a sensation and a reaction to them. This would be possibly bolstered by the idea that critics can agree often about what they taste in a sauce, but value it differently. So you might have two restaurant critics, they might agree perfectly well about the components that went into the sauce, about how spicy it was, how hot, how varied, how well balanced, how acidic, and so on. But one of them thinks the predominant notes of sorrel here no good and detracts from the sauce and its complementing of the other parts of the meal. And one critic might say it's ideal, it heightens and amplifies some of the best parts and best features of the things that we're eating. So you could have these two parts. The trouble would be that we don't always distinguish ourselves between the descriptive and the evaluative language. And in fact, with professional tasters, tasters of coffee and tea, and tasters of wine, trained in academies of enology in France, it's very hard to get them to separate out the descriptive and the evaluative. Trying to get them to do it, trying to get them to divide their terms and say, which terms are just responding to what you see as the features that you're picking out in the object that you're imbibing, and which are rating it in some way. People are not good at separating. That might suggest that we don't always notice there are two components and that they might come very close. The other reason why we might not notice is because one comes very hard on the heels of another. We react very quickly. When you put something in your mouth and you like or don't like it, you have to make an instant decision about it. So it may be that it's very hard to distinguish between the experience of liking, responding at that level, and the taste itself. They may come so tightly woven, they may be so almost inseparable in the perception that you have, that you just think the food has the quality which in fact is not a quality of the food, but a response from you. I mean, this is, children say, certainly in England, why do you want me to eat this spinach? It's disgusting. Disgusting is the property of the spinach as far as they're concerned. It's just horrible. I might say this about an avocado. I might say, oh, avocado, that's horrible. as if it was a property of the avocado, as if I didn't distinguish it from the food itself. Now, why might we do that? Well, we might do that because where there is widespread agreement, it doesn't matter. Where we know, and we do all know, that sour milk is disgusting, and where we all know that spoiled foods and toxic foods and foods that are excessively bitter are found disgusting, we will converge and we will find these to be properties of the foods and liquids that we're taking in. But where we discover that we're standing out and we're rather anomalous, we might have to realize we're kind of idiosyncratic. Oh, look, other people don't find spinach so disgusting or don't find the avocado disgusting. Oh, it probably isn't a property of it. And indeed, don't you have to first recognize that it's an avocado before you reject it? I mean, if it wasn't recognized as an avocado, it's not obvious why you would have that affective response. So it looks as though the two-tier model is appealing. And of course, within our group, if other people have those same reactions, we can make the mistake of just projecting those emotive responses, those evaluative responses, right onto the properties of the foods and liquids we imbibe. That's one thing we might try and say. That would have the view that when we talk about taste judgments, as opposed to just tasting experiences, that they involve the discrimination, which thing am I actually tasting, and a preference. Now, the preference can be more or less objective, of course. You might think that the preference is a mere matter of liking. It really just is about whether it's desirable for you. But you might think that we've got the ability not just to recognize something about ourselves, but to recognize what's preferable, as though it really is a property of the object. And this would suggest, even if we had the two-tier model, perhaps we could try to move towards a kind of objectivity of some of these rather more slippery properties. Perhaps they're even properties that aestheticians talk about as aesthetic properties of the world, if we thought there was something preferable about one meal or one food or one beverage over another. So these might be not as it were mere liking, but aesthetic preferences. So taste judgments, and this is a reason for seeing why taste was used as a model for aesthetic judgment. Culinary taste and aesthetic taste would be species of the same genus. They involve preference, and the preference can either be a mere personal liking or can be the response to a feature of the object due to its aesthetic properties, that it's preferable because it has these aesthetic features. Okay. Now, tea tasters, chefs, wine critics, and so on can actually be in the position of judging the quality of food, even if it's not to their liking. They can find themselves asked to judge on panels, to judge in competitions, and they can say, well, that was a much better sauce, this was much better achieved, this wine is much better than that, this vintage is much better than another, but it's not for me. It's not to my taste. There are tea tasters who are very good and who are relied on by the industry to judge the quality of tea and who don't like tea. So why not? So this would suggest that there might be, as it were, features other than this mere subjective response or reaction, and this might move us towards getting a deal of objectivity even into these evaluative components. Okay, now, that picture is going to show us that it's quite tricky to tell the two-tier story, the Voltaire story, that taste invites reflection. It's quite difficult to establish the view that you first have the sensory experience and then you have the evaluative reaction to it. Because it might turn out, and indeed there's a little bit of psychological evidence to suggest, that it's the evaluative component, it's the preference judgment, it's this affective response that helps you partly to identify the substance that you're taking in. So rather than waiting and being attendant on a perception, it is part of what guides you, drives you towards something, to identify the food or the liquid that you're having. Also, taste experiences, if they were had first and then they become wrapped into a larger taste judgment, which involves an affective response, that seems to detract from the idea that taste experiences are themselves bound up with pleasure, with appreciating or with not appreciating. Namely, that taste as a sense is perhaps the least neutral of our senses. It's the one which has right at the base of having the experience is having this pleasure, this accepting or not accepting, this evaluation of what you're drinking or what you're chewing on. The only time I think we want something tasteless, as opposed to judging whether we like or dislike, is water. This is a personal view, but I always try to select those waters which have the least taste. They are, to me, the most neutral. And it turns out they're not the same for people because of their previous exposure and background. I'm surprised at the sorts of things that count as tasteless water to native Londoners who are used to high levels of chemical and 5 times recycling of the same water. Having come from Glasgow and the Scottish lochs, I can taste the purity of water with much less adulteration, with much less chemical, and I seek waters with low mineral, low salt, low additives. So I think we sometimes look for neutrality, but hardly ever. Usually our taste experience is already giving us a reaction. Now that might make you think taste is this non-neutral sense and is different, but that's not right. Taste isn't alone. Some sounds have a kind of immediate evaluative component too. Half of you will react, half of you won't. If you think of fingernails being drawn down a chalkboard, some of you will immediately have the hairs rise on the back of your neck and you'll start to feel slightly uncomfortable. It doesn't do anything for me, it doesn't matter at all, but I can see that you're reacting, and so I think, well, you must have this immediate reaction, I don't have that reaction, and I'll bet you I'm hearing the same sound, but you are having this attendant, very closely tied up, very bound up experience of finding it unpleasant. I feel like this about certain fabrics, certain kinds of coarse industrial nylon. If I have my hands on it, just again gives me goose pimples and I feel very, very disturbed by it, but others just fine. So then we recognize that it's not the case that taste is the only sense which has these kind of qualities, but it might have more of them, and that might make us think that it's right there in the guts and the basic level of taste experience that it is evaluative rather than the two-stage model. And of course there can be some variations with, as we see with the nails on a chalkboard, but there's enormous commonality because the population tends to just divide into those who can't bear it and those who can. Okay. So, tasting and tastes. We perceive and respond. It's hard to separate, but possible, perhaps, the response and the perception. And what we perceive could be very similar, and these differences that come later may be idiosyncratic or more widely shared, and where they're widely shared, we think they're part of the experience, and where they're not, we might have more attraction towards the two-tier model. So subjective experiences with some greater validity might make us think that that's part of the taste that we're experiencing, but it's not universal. Okay. But there's another source of variability which I think is more interesting, because remember, we want to explain if tastes are objective features of the world, we have reactions and responses to them, we have perceptions of them. We still want a way of understanding why the variation is there, and I don't want all of the variation to be down to the chemical element. And I want us to remember this thing that people often say, no point in giving me your very exquisite foods and liquids and beverages to drink, because they'll be wasted on me. I won't be able to appreciate them. So there's this issue. I want to ask this question: what can you taste? What can you taste in food and liquids? And that question is actually 3 questions. What can you taste in a food and a liquid? What can you taste in a food and a liquid? And what can you taste in a food and a liquid? And you can think of those as the what, who, and how of tasting. And the answers to these questions interact, because perhaps what can be tasted depends on who is doing the tasting. So maybe there are expert tasters who can pick up on things that we just can't get. And maybe what depends on how we're tasting. I think the second is true, because I think it's how you taste that will turn people into expert tasters and will reveal to them things that were there in their experience, but they were not able to pick up on and detect. Okay, so this takes us to why tasting is difficult. It needs great concentration, focused attention, but attention to what and attention away from what? Well, the experience of tasting a food or coffee has a subjective character. It's part of conscious experience with a hedonic value. It's pleasurable. That's what motivates us to eat it. And for that reason, we think there's what we experience on the one hand, and there's our having the experience of it. And because we eat for pleasure, we're mostly focused on ourselves. We're mostly focused on what is it like for us to taste this exquisite dish? What is it like for us to sample the best coffee? What is it like for us to taste the finest tea? We're thinking of us and our experience. But there's a shift that's needed to get away from what is it like for us to what is it like, the thing I'm tasting, the tea, the dish, and so on. And that shift from yourself to the thing that's giving you the experience, harder for some people than others to shift away from self and onto what they're having an experience of. But I want to just give you, for the last minute or so, I want to just give you a sense of how it can be done. It can be done if you think of it, this shift from concentrating on yourself to concentrating on the object. It can be done in touch. So you can shift from, as psychologists say, from tactile to haptic and back and forward. I give you a box of fabrics with silk, satin, velvet in it, and I ask you to plunge your hand into it, and just using your hand, not looking inside, I want you to identify which are the velvet, which are the fabric swatches, which are the silks, and you will feel around and you will identify and pull them apart. But I might suddenly say to you, okay, forget searching for those, just what is it like to feel velvet? What's the experience like? And now you switch from feeling the surface of the object. You're still moving your hands across it, but now the concentration is on you and your experience and not on the object and what properties it has. I think you have to perform the reverse move when you're involved in appreciating and assessing food and flavor. So let me just ask, how do we get to be experienced tasters? I think we get to be experienced tasters because we stop classifying things by our preferences and our liking and by features of those things themselves. We aim to be more discriminating about the things that we're looking for, and as that discrimination comes about, we start to get better. The hardest case is the one you usually have. If I give you a cup of something, or if I give you a single mouthful of a dish to taste, and then I say, okay, I want you to assess this or tell me what it's like, it's very, very difficult. Because what are you relying on? You're relying on just this single experience and your previous memory or your previous knowledge. But if I give you two dishes that are different and I ask you to compare, immediately you can see the difference, you can note the difference, you can see which properties one has, the other lacks. It's discrimination and finding difference that's actually important for improving your flavor perception. And then more discrimination will make you more discriminating. Here's a lovely quote from Michael Baxendale, an art historian, talking about art, but it does perfectly well for taste, judgments about the culinary, and shows you the link between the culinary and the aesthetic. He says, much of what we call taste lies in this: the conformity between discrimination demanded by a painting and skills of discrimination possessed by the beholder. We enjoy our own exercise of skill, and we particularly enjoy the playful exercise of skill which we use in normal life very earnestly. If a painting gives us opportunity for exercising a valued skill and rewards our virtuosity with a sense of worthwhile insights about that painting's organization, we tend to enjoy it.